So chapter 19 is about hypothalamus. And hypothalamus is a very important part of the brain for homeostasis. Without hypothalamus, a person cannot live. It has a lot of different functions. Anatomically, it is part of diencephalon, but physiologically or functionally, it is part of the limbic system. As you can see here, the hypothalamus is indirectly connected with the different parts of the cortex of the brain, and that will also affect part of our behavior. Hypothalamus is connected with the thalamus because thalamus, the dorsomedial and anterior nucleus, is part of limbic system also, and these parts also connect with the cortex of the brain. Amygdala, which is for memory of negative emotions, and hippocampus for the retention of the short-term memory. These are part of the limbic system, and it is connected with the hypothalamus. Retina is connected with hypothalamus, and that is related to circadian rhythm. Basal ganglia, the ventral striatum and nucleus accumbens, as well as the cerebellum. These are part of the motor system that is connected with hypothalamus, and that gives that's related to motivational and motor response to some of the emotional and visceral function. Also, the somatic and visceral information is passing through the spinal cord and the brainstem. And again, that will affect the behavioral response, similar to the basal ganglia and cortex of the brain. Hypothalamus is very important for the endocrine function, both for the anterior and the posterior pituitary glands. So I will come back to that later. Also, hypothalamus is connected with reticular formation, and as you know, reticular formation is important for the visceral function. So hypothalamus has a major effect on the function of cardiovascular and respiratory system. This is the anatomy of hypothalamus. So hypothalamus is located below the thalamus. This is the thalamus, and this is the interthalamic adhesion. This area, this you can see, this is the third ventricle, this here. So hypothalamus also makes part of the third ventricle, the wall and the floor of the third ventricle. Anteriorly, it is located posterior to lamina terminalis. This is lamina terminalis, and also anterior commissure, which is connecting the two temporal lobes on each side. Here you can see the fornix. So fornix is connecting hypothalamus with hippocampus, and above that you can see this is the background, is the lateral ventricle, and this area that you see is a part of the septum pellucidum, and obviously this is the corpus callosum. Posteriorly here, this is the end of the hypothalamus, and the posterior part of the mammillary body is the end of the hypothalamus. Inferiorly, you can see the mammillary bodies, and also if you come here around this area, this area is called tuberal cinereum, and below that is the pituitary stalk or infundibulum, and infundibulum is connecting hypothalamus with pituitary gland, and also hypothalamus is located above the optic nerve and optic chiasm. Also, this area that you see here, this is called hypothalamic sulcus. So above this area is thalamus, and below that area is the hypothalamus. These are the different areas or zones of the hypothalamus. So you can see that there is hypothalamus has different nuclei because the functions of hypothalamus is very, very diverse. This is the anterior area, so it contains paraventricular because it's closer to the lateral ventricle. It has the preoptic, so this is the optic nerve, so preoptic, and the anterior nucleus behind that, and also you have the suprachiasmatic and supraoptic nucleus are above the optic nerve and optic chiasm. The middle area is also called tuberal area, so it's made of the dorsomedial nucleus, ventromedial nucleus, and the arcuate nucleus. And the posterior area is made of the posterior nucleus and the mammillary body. There's also a lateral area, one on each side, and that is more diffuse. So at the background, that the orange area that you see, that is the lateral nucleus. So now about each area specifically. So anterior area is divided into medial and lateral zone. For the medial zone, you have different parts. So one is the preoptic and anterior nuclei. So if you look at this image, this is the anterior nucleus, and anterior to that is the preoptic nucleus, and that's contains parasympathetic neurons, and which causes decrease in temperature, and if the body temperature goes up, so that's important for thermoregulation, and that reduces the body temperature, and I'll come back to that later. It's also, as you know, the parasympathetic system is part of rest and sleep, so it induces sleepiness. The suprachiasmatic nucleus that you see in this area, also close to this area is the supraoptic. So this is important for the circadian rhythm. This is the most important function of that, but also secrete some hormone. These hormones are called regulatory hormones, and the regulatory hormones are divided into releasing and inhibitory hormones. So if the preoptic and anterior nuclei are damaged, then because it cannot reduce the temperature, so that can cause a problem with the thermoregulation and results in hyperthermia. And also, if the suprachiasmatic nucleus is destroyed, then the circadian rhythm is also damaged. The circadian rhythm is not only controlled by suprachiasmatic nucleus, there is other areas also, and I'll come back to that later. So the medial zone, again, we are in the anterior area of the medial zone, so there is other nucleus, supraoptic, which is difficult, you cannot see it in this image. So that is, there's two hormones that are made here. One is oxytocin, and the other one is ADH or vasopressin. And ADH actually is made more here than oxytocin, and I will come back to the function of those hormones later. They are made here, and then they go and store in the posterior part of the pituitary gland. So let me mention it here, that if this is destroyed, then it can cause diabetes insipidus, which is a problem with the antidiuretic hormone, and water is not absorbed there, and a person is urinating a lot. Then is the other one is the paraventricular, which is this nucleus, and that is closer to the third ventricle, so that's the name there. It contains two types of cells. One is magnocellular cells, and these are the one that produces oxytocin and ADH, but more commonly oxytocin. So if it is destroyed, then it will cause Sheehan syndrome, and this happens usually during labor. If the mother is losing a lot of blood, so there's not enough blood goes to the hypothalamus, and that causes necrosis of this area. And when the person, after the labor, Usually the symptoms happens after the labor, that the milk cannot come down. So because oxytocin is important for contraction of the mammillary glands, so the mother produced milk, but the milk cannot come down. It also produces one of those regulatory hormones. So these are made by the parvocellular cells. But again, the most common important function is that paraventricular nucleus is making oxytocin. The lateral zone, which is this area, and that has a parasympathetic activity, and they contain orexinergic neurons, and they are producing orexin, and the orexins are important for feeding. So if they are destroyed, so the person does not eating, so the person is starved and cannot drink anything, and they eventually die. So the middle area is again divided into medial zone and the lateral zone. So the medial zone has a lot more nucleus than the lateral one, and one of them is the dorsomedial nucleus, which is this one, and that is important for emotional behavior and partially has a role in the circadian rhythm. So if this nucleus is damaged, then the person has a very aggressive or savage behavior. Ventromedial, which is this one, and it is just the opposite of the lateral zone. So this is inhibiting eating and drinking. So the satiety center is there when a person is eating there. So this center is activated and make sure the person does not overeat. And if this area is destroyed, then the obesity results there. And sometimes this area may not destroy, but the receptors are not working properly, and that's why the person is eating a lot, and this center is not controlling the eating or drinking habits. The arcuate nucleus is around here. There's also medial and lateral arcuate, and they are secreting, releasing, and inhibitory hormones. This nucleus contains dopamine, and dopamine is inhibiting prolactin. So if this nucleus is damaged, then too much prolactin is produced, and the person is producing milk even if the person is not pregnant, or even in a male it can produce milk, the mammary glands. And also the neuropeptides are important in the feeding reflex. So if this area is destroyed, the feeding reflex cannot happen, and the person is not able to eat properly and starve. The lateral zone is similar to the one that we saw in the anterior area. So that's the continuation of same type of neurons, and they are parasympathetic ones, and they are important for eating and drinking. So the destruction of that again cause starvation and dehydration and death. So this is the lateral area, which was similar to the previous one. And the posterior zone, it has the posterior nucleus is a big one, and posterior nucleus. So this is the sympathetic neurons are located there. So they are important for production of milk, so increasing metabolic activity. If the body is cold, so the system is activated. So important for thermoregulation, and also because it produces norepinephrine. So that is important for arousal, wakefulness, focus, and concentration. And if it is damaged, then it's a problem with the thermoregulation again. So the person feels cold, if both the anterior and posterior nuclei are damaged, then the person will be like a cold-blooded animal. So they cannot control their body heat. So if the environment is warm, they will be warm. If the environment is cold, they will be cold too. Also, damage to this nucleus will cause confusion and even coma, and the person may not wake up. And then is the mammillary body. So mammillary because it looks like mammillary gland, mammillary structures or the human breast. So that's why the name is there. And it's important for memory, especially olfactory memory, and also it's important for um, eating or feeding reflex, for example, licking an ice cream or chewing or biting, things like that. For example, you when you eat something, you just bite and then you start chewing, but you don't think about chewing. That reflex continues, and mammillary body or mammillary nucleus is responsible for that. And if there is damage to that, you will get a Wernicke's encephalopathy, and this is also caused by thiamine or vitamin B1 deficiency. Is more common in alcoholics, so they may get confusion and problem with um, movement of the eyes and things like that.